program committee for the local league. And on behalf of the board of directors, I'd like to welcome you here today. We're delighted to see so many here in person, as well as those who are joining us by Zoom. The League of Women Voters is a nonpartisan, nonprofit political organization that encourages the informed and active participation of citizens in government. We work to increasing understanding of major political issues and influence public policy through education and advocacy. We take action on public policy positions established through member study and agreement. As a nonpartisan organization, we do not support or oppose any political party or candidate. Before we I asked Sophia to introduce our speakers for today, I wanted to remind you of a few housekeeping details. One is I encourage you to take a look at the flyers that you find on your table, describing the various ways that you can become involved in our mission of engaging and educating voters. We would love to get to know you better, and we are very happy to welcome anyone who would like to share in our work. Let me also encourage you to go to the website of the State League. That's my.lwv.org. And you can see all of the programs and the information that the State League provides. In particular, I wanted to draw your attention to 3 virtual programs that they will be doing coming up in the next couple of days, November 9th, 11th, and 14th, about issues that voters in Wisconsin will face in the 2024 election year. These include redistricting in the state, amendments to the Wisconsin Constitution, and how to overcome barriers to voting and election administrative challenges. Anyone can attend, but you do need to register in order to get the link. So please visit the website in order to register for that. Just a quick reminder that today's program is being recorded, and a link to the recording will be available on our website for later viewing. And after the presentation, we will take questions here in the room, and also if you're joining us online, if you go to the chat feature, which is at the bottom of your screen for those viewing at home. And now I'd like to invite another member of the program committee, Sophia Root, who will introduce today's speaker.
Good morning, everyone. Almost good afternoon. I stand behind that. Okay, sounds great. Thank you. I was instructed to stand behind this podium. But good morning, everyone. I am Sophia. I am the student member for the program committee for the League of Women Voters. I go to UWL. I'm a public health student there. I'm also studying public administration. Today I am going to introduce our 3 lovely speakers. Will Van Rosenbeek is the UWL's LGBTQ+ service director. He uses he, him, they, them pronouns. Will identifies as a trans man and queer. Will has been as a queer person for over 30 years. However, he did not come out as trans until the early 2000s. He lives in La Crosse, Wisconsin with his partner Tara and their dog Rudy. Tara and Will have been together for over 33 years. They have been legally married for 19. Will works at the University of Wisconsin-La Crosse as the LGBTQ+ services director. You could say LGBTQ+ issues are his life. Will is an uncle to 4 nieces and 1 nephew whom he loves dearly. He identifies as neurodiverse due to his learning disability. He's a first-generation college student, and college was not easy for him. However, the university life fueled him, and that's why he ended up earning a master's degree in student affairs, so that he can spend his life on campus helping LGBTQ+ students. He also volunteers in the community. He serves on the board of directors for the 7 Rivers LGBTQ+ Connection in downtown La Crosse. This is where he started a trans support group called the Trans Forum. Can we please have a round of applause for Will?
Good afternoon, everybody. Let's say it's. I'm very happy to be here. I felt like I've had lots of great experiences with the League of Women Voters. We see them all the time on campus. They are hardworking, and I think their hard work has paid off because at UWL, our students are really good voters. They come out to vote in great numbers, and I think part of that is because they're being taught throughout, but also our student association is really good, making sure that students know how to vote. So thank you for all your work. I'm going to start and I'm going to do some of the basic stuff, which I guess I got the easy work here. I wanted to start, and I think it's important that we started with the basic stuff, just so that everybody kind of was on the same page in what we're talking about today. So there are 4 little ovals that were little circles on the screen up here. And I want to say that every one of us has an identity in each one of these little circles. We may not realize we do, but we all do. All of us were assigned a sex at birth. Basically, because, you know, the doctor looks at the baby and says it's a whatever. In this day and age, we're really stuck on this assigned sex at birth, but oftentimes we call it gender, which is not the correct word. So those gender reveal parties, not gender reveal parties. They're sex assigned at birth parties is what they should be called. And also, we all have sorry, that's good. All of us also have gender identity. And gender identity, I think, is a little bit more complicated. It's how we feel internally about our gender, how we see ourselves. And if your gender identity is congruent with your sex assigned at birth, so if you were born male and you grew up like a little boy, you felt like a young man, become a man, or if you grew up, you were born assigned female at birth and you grew up as a little girl and that felt good to you and you like feminine things and you become a woman. If your gender identity and sex assigned at birth are congruent, you probably don't even know you have a gender identity because it just fits perfectly. Kind of like the perfect pair of pants that you have or a shirt that you like that just fits you perfectly. But for some folks, their gender identity is not congruent with their sex assigned at birth. And I feel like for people like myself, it becomes evident that something is askew. I didn't know that was gender identity because we don't talk about gender identity, or at least we didn't when I was growing up, to know that that was a piece of who I was. Gender expression, how you express your gender outwardly. That could be in the way you dress, the things that you like to do, your mannerisms, the way that you talk. And again, gender expression really has been based on that there is only a binary of masculine and feminine. I think we're getting a little bit better at understanding that there are people that don't fall in either one of those identities, but still gender expression is predominantly looked at within that masculine or feminine. And again, none of these have to be kind of aligned in a person in what we think it might, what alignment might look like. And then lastly, sexual and romantic attraction. So who you're sexually attracted to, who you're romantically attracted to, and we kind of break those out. And we won't be talking really much about that at all today. We're going to be focused on the other 2. I want to just touch on this a little bit. Obviously, when we're born, they have to put a gender on or the sex on a birth certificate. And in most states, it's still only male or female that can be put on there. There are a greater number of states that are changing that so that people could put an X on a baby's birth certificate. I think that's helpful, especially for families who have intersex children. And intersex is really more of a medical explanation of a child who maybe they're, let me just think about this for a second. I don't know why all of a sudden I just got nervous, but a child who could be related to their body, could be related to hormones or chromosomes that does not fit with the typical male or female. And allowing an X might be helpful for those folks, but also allowing an X for other people to use as well. there are still some other states that are allowing adults to change their birth certificate to an X as well. So if they identify as non-binary or trans and maybe non-binary, they would rather have that X on there. And so it's becoming more popular. It certainly isn't everywhere, and it's not in the state of Wisconsin. So I want to just talk about some of the language that might be part of what we're talking about today. And that is different identities that fall under the transgender umbrella. So transgender really could be the overarching umbrella term for all of these identities. It also is an identity that lots of people use for themselves. For myself, I use transgender or trans. In the past, historically, you might have heard people use the term transsexual, especially talking about somebody who wants to transition within the binary. But transsexual is not really a term that I hear people using today. Kind of an older term that I don't think people are using quite right now. The term cisgender, cis meaning same, is somebody, I kind of talked about that before, somebody whose gender identity and sex assigned at birth are congruent. So if that is true for you, we would refer to you as someone who is cisgender. I know that some people have felt like, I don't want to be called that. It's not a bad thing to be called that. It's just allows us to say how you identify, and that becomes clear. And then it is helpful for not othering folks. We all have different identities. So I'm transgender, you might be cisgender. That's fine. The term genderqueer is a little bit of an older term that is part of this community. Genderqueer meaning somebody who does not fit into the gender binary. They might, or they might be somebody who does fit in the gender binary, but also outside of the gender binary. It's very much dependent on the person. And I know I'm using the word queer, which for some people that might, make your hair stand up on your back of your neck. Certainly for people my age and older, that word was used against the LGBT community, oftentimes in very violent ways. And younger people, really probably about 15 years ago or so, younger people started taking back that word. They didn't have that history. And they were viewing this word as a word that they could kind of define individually for themselves. At first, I think people started using the word queer as like a powerful or political word. So I would see students, write signs like queer pride, we have it. Or when they're, talking about voting and stuff like that, the word pride. Now I would say that it really has become a word that people use because maybe there isn't another identity definition that fits for them. So I can use the word queer to talk about my sexual orientation or romantic orientation. I could use the word queer to talk about my gender identity. And it is kind of something that you define yourself. If you meet somebody that uses that word, I wouldn't immediately say, how do you define that? I'd kind of wait until I knew them a little bit better. Also, I would say that if you're not part of the LGBT community, using the word queer, I would suggest maybe not using that unless it is the word that the community around you uses. I have certainly met some students that felt if you were cisgender and straight, you're not allowed to use that word. That I don't really think that is true, but just be careful because for some people that's so sensitive. And certainly there are older folks and younger folks who maybe don't use that word at all because it still can be used against you. The term non-binary is one that I think has become really the identity that a lot of people identify with, and not interested, maybe not being trans necessarily, but you could still also be trans within non-binary. So non-binary again is looking at the fact that there is more than masculine and feminine or male and female, and that you might identify with all of those, including falling outside of that gender binary, or you identify with several gender identities that work for you. The fact that we sometimes may use the word trans even when somebody doesn't want to transition is an okay thing. Just because somebody is transgender or trans does not mean that they want to necessarily transition within the binary or outside of the binary. That is kind of up to every individual. And yeah, I guess I'll just I think the physician Erin will probably talk more about that. Gender fluid is just like it sounds. Somebody's gender is fluid, and that could mean daily, it could mean hourly, it could just mean whatever feels right for them that day. Something that's important with gender fluid is to remember that when folks are gender fluid, that might mean that their pronouns might change depending on how they're identifying at the time. Bigender is somebody who has maybe 2 or more gender identities that they identify with. Pan meaning all, identifying with all gender identities, so more than maybe 2 or 3. And then agender, A meaning none, somebody who doesn't identify with gender, any gender. And then we'd always include clear and questioning, because I think if some of these identities don't fit for you, using the word queer might be a better word. And then questioning them, since we're on a college campus, a lot of students come, and that's when they start questioning. Of course, a lot of them are starting at a lot younger age, which is wonderful. So I want to talk a little bit about pronouns. I know we're real familiar with she, her, hers, and he, him, his, but we also need to become aware that there are other pronouns that people use that are not gendered, are more inclusive. And so I'm sure you've all heard people use they, them, and theirs as a singular. That is something that is totally cool to do. The folks that write the dictionary many years ago, several years ago, included it as a singular. I noticed that if once I start paying attention, I use they, them, and theirs as a singular a lot. And you all probably do too. For example, if Adam and I were at the airport and Mark came in and just threw his bags down and then walked away, I might look at Adam and say, oh God, they just left their bags there. You know, you're not supposed to do that, right? So we use it as a singular already. It shouldn't be that difficult to transition to. I think it's a great pronoun for folks to use. Sometimes I think our students use they, them, and theirs because they think we're not smart enough to use some of the more inclusive pronouns, which is kind of sad to think that they are kind of dumbing it down for me because I'm older. But I understand that maybe I'd be more apt to use they, them, and theirs than some of the other ones because I'm not as familiar. But there are some inclusive pronouns, am, air. There is z, which could be ze or xe. And so it could be z, zers, or z, here, here's. The per and pers, which stands for person, my favorite. And then sometimes people don't use any pronouns. They just say, I would like you to use my name. If you don't know somebody's pronouns, I would recommend not guessing. And I would use their name, or I would use they, them, theirs until I find out what their pronouns are. And if you start doing that, it kind of, you know, for me, it kind of became oh yeah, now I can just do that automatically. But I wanted to give us a chance to use some of these pronouns. So if you can, so I got some sentences for us to read. Hopefully you can read them. So I'm going to talk about them before we read it together. This is going to be like school, if you remember, we read together. This first one, I say this is my nibbling. Nibbling is how you might talk about a niece or nephew that does not identify as male or female. So if you have a trans nephew or a non-binary nephew or niece or child, instead of using that word nephew or niece, you use nibbling, which I think is pretty cool. And in this case, we're going to use the pronoun her and hers. So you see it there. So everybody ready? Okay. No. Okay, we'll give it a try anyhow. You can do it. If you can't read it, just listen. This is my nibbling Kate. Her is a first-year student at the University of Minnesota. Pierre's majoring in physics. So I'm just, instead of saying he or she or they, we're using the word per, and pers. This next one, we're going to be using z. And in this case, we're going to do a z and zir, but it also could be z and here, and could be spelled with the x or the z, depending on the person's what they would like. So it's the z and zir. Okay. If you want to join us Saturday, you'll have to connect with Jess. Z is purchasing the tickets and making the reservations. I would connect Zero today. Awesome. This last one, we're using the AM air. So we're using A and airs. Yeah, so let's read that one. Did you talk with Alex about the conference? A mentioned wanting to attend. This would be Air's first conference. So I think it is kind of scary to use them initially. And I know for myself, if I don't practice, the first time I use it should not be when I'm talking to that person or referring to that person with other people that know them. So when I practice, then I know I can do it better. And so I've encouraged folks, if you know somebody, maybe you have a relative or a friend, practice with some of your friends before you use those publicly with other folks. And I just wanted to say a little, just very quickly, that the number of LGBT youth is definitely growing. And I would say that the percentage of transgender and non-binary youth, we're starting to get some numbers. The numbers that we have aren't great because we haven't really been collecting this data very well. I also would say that probably there are some people that even if the questions were there, maybe they wouldn't answer them because maybe I'm afraid that that information would somehow get to my family or that information would somehow get out into the public. So we have a long way to go to get real numbers. But here we're talking about 1.6% of American adults are transgender. When we start looking, I was looking at the UCLA Williams Institute, which has really good data. They're talking that 300,000 transgender folks are between the ages of 13 and 17. And, that's a great number, but we know it's low because it's not accurate, 100% accurate. And so I would just say that in the future, I think what we're seeing is that queer, non-binary, and trans students, we're going to start seeing that population really grow. And I think we're kind of ready for trans folks. But I think when we talk about trans and non-binary folks, that is the next, I think, layer of identity and thinking about how we will respond when we see folks that identify that way working and out in public, and what can we do to help that along. And so I would just encourage you to, one, keep educating yourself. We have a great LGBT center downtown. You can come to any of the events at UWL. You're welcome to come to those. And that's a great way to educate yourself. Read. There are so many great books out right now. And so I would encourage you to do that. The web, obviously there's a lot out there too. So keep educating yourself. This is not a one and done. I certainly have had some folks at UWL who were like, I went to an ally training 8 years ago, I'm good. Well, you're not, because it changes all the time. So it's something that we have to continue to educate ourselves. And I'd encourage you to support the LGBT community. We need that in La Crosse. And, I think some of the most important things, and I think, you all do this already, but showing up and speaking up. And, we're having some challenges right now in the state with, some laws and bills that are anti-trans. And we really need a lot of people speaking out about that and educating our peers. Because even when they were putting these bills forward, some of the questions that people that were voting on these bills it was very clear they didn't understand what they were voting on. So what can we do to kind of educate our families and our neighbors and stuff like that? And the more you can help us with that, the better it will be. So thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, Will. Next up is Adam. Adam is an LGBTQ plus peer educator at UWL. Adam is a psychology major as well and has worked in the Pride Center for 3 years. Adam has done numerous educational presentations, events, and workshops on transgender topics such as medical care, transphobia, politics, and acceptance. Let's give a round of applause for Adam.
much longer and way cooler intro because I'm really bad at bios. So a little bit about myself. I'm 22 years old. I think I've been out for about 5 years now. I've worked in the Pride Center for 3 years. I've been on hormones for 3 years. My anniversary is coming up. I'm a psych major, and I am very wordy. I write too much. So I apologize. This is very information heavy. But it's really important information that has been erased in a lot of cases or ignored. So my focus, Will's focus, was on the educating part, and I love that. I'm really just throwing y'all to the wind. My focus is on the history of trans people and our care, and then the positive and negative legislation that has kind of come about related to that. So our healthcare has been mystified and politicized, often by fear-mongering and intentionally false information, especially on how long trans people and trans care has been around and how long we have existed. Our definitions and understanding of being trans has changed immensely throughout the centuries. However, there is gender variance documented throughout our human existence. And so I'm really going to cover the myth that trans people and trans care are a new trend, because they really are not. So let's go back to 600 BCE Greece. Aphrodite was the son of Hermes and Aphrodite, who merged bodies with a nymph so they could be inseparable in their love. Aphrodite is a fertility god with a masculine name and a penis, but a very feminine appearance and very feminine clothing. Later, they are called hermaphroditos. And this is where we get the term hermaphrodite. And that's why, for a while, trans people were called hermaphrodites or intersex people. There's some medical side to that gets very complex. That is no longer an acceptable term, especially for humans. That is more of a biology term now. And then 222 CE, there was a Roman emperor named Elagabalus who was installed at age 14. She wore feminine clothing and preferred to be called empress or emperor. She desperately sought gender-affirming surgery, offering large prizes for anyone who could perform it. She was a heavily controversial ruler because of her violations of gender, sexual, and religious norms at the time. Thomasine/Thomas Hall was an intersex person in England and later in the colony of Virginia in the 1600s. They were subjected to several genital inspections to determine their gender. And after a judge determined that they were both male and female, it decided that they must dress both in masculine and feminine clothes at the same time. So a specific number of feminine clothes and a specific number of masculine clothes, which sounds kind of cool, but unfortunately it was so they could be designated as a gender deviant, which, yeah. But throughout their life, they switched openly between expressing as a man and a woman, and even at one point fought in the military. And in the mid-1700s in Northeast United States, there was a Quaker preacher who by today's definitions would identify as probably non-binary or agender. They woke up from a debilitating illness and claimed that they had died and woken up genderless. They rejected all forms of gender and took on a new name called the Public Universal Friend. Friend would not answer to their dead name at all and would not use gender pronouns and would openly say, those are not my pronouns, and people use them. And throughout history, women have dressed as men in order to go to war. Many of these women went to war, came back, and then kind of took off that male persona. They really only dressed as men to be able to fight. But throughout history, there have been women who never took that off. They became men, and a lot of them even married women when they came home. In the mid-1800s in Illinois, Albert Gibshier was assigned female at birth, but even from a young age dressed in men's clothing so he could work. Female children couldn't work. He later joined the Union as a man during the Civil War. His identity was discovered several times during his life due to injury, but the doctors and friends covered it up for him and didn't out him. It was kept a secret until late in his life. He was investigated for fraud by the Veterans Board, Because when he was outed as a woman, they were like, well, you didn't fight, you were a woman. Let's see. But his comrades from the war came in and they testified for him. And it was decided that Cashier did fight in the war and that he would therefore keep his war pension. He was unfortunately forced to wear women's clothing in the mental institute where he later died, but he was buried in uniform with military honors. We learn this history to avoid repeating it, but unfortunately we can see this history repeating itself right now with the attack on gender-affirming clinics and care across America. So the next two examples. In 1918, there was a German physician named Magnus Hirschfeld, who is largely considered the father of trans healthcare. He coined the term transvestite at the Institute for Sexual Science, and he performed the first 5 known sex-affirming surgeries in the West. Unfortunately, his research was completely destroyed as the Institute was one of the first places targeted by the Nazis in 1933. And his invaluable research was burned during the book burnings. In 1966, the Johns Hopkins Gender Clinic opened in Maryland, and it was the only gender clinic of its kind in the US at the time that affirmed patients' gender instead of forced them into conformity. Unfortunately, the clinic was only open for 13 years and was closed in 1979 due to political backlash. And a year later, in 1980, Ronald Reagan determined that gender-affirming care was experimental and should therefore not be covered by state insurance, federal insurance. Unfortunately, private insurance soon followed, and this set back gender-affirming medical care several decades by making any gender-affirming research unaffordable and socially unacceptable. So this really burns down to the fact that trans-affirming care is at least 105 years old in the West. And it was not invented by millennials or Gen Z. And in this, I used a lot of Western examples to focus on kind of how we got to our history here and now. But outside of the US, there are tons of cultures and tons of people with gender variance, gender, all kinds of stuff. And unfortunately, this history is erased and censored, and we're watching very, very concerning history repeat itself. We are seeing don't say gay bills, policy excluding trans people from public spaces, legislature attacking and banning affirming care that is backed by science. And of course, the violence and murder against trans people. This happened in Germany in the 1930s, it happened at Stonewall in the 1960s, and it's happening again as we speak. During a time when we are making phenomenal jumps in science and technology, we are falling back decades in social issues and civil rights issues. And a lot of this is happening without most people knowing. As of yesterday, there have been 586 anti-trans bills proposed in the US in 2023 alone. 85 of those bills have passed, 125 have failed. In 2020, there were 56 anti-trans bills. In 2021, there was 156. In 2022, there were 175. Of course, again in 2023, 586. We are seeing a massive uptick in legislation that targets trans people directly. And some examples of these bills are banning gender-affirming care for minors, labeling it child abuse and experimentation, banning gender-affirming care into adulthood, and making it a felony for medical professionals to perform. We're labeling transgender parents and parents who affirm their children's gender as child abusers. And there are, of course, the military bans, bathroom bans, and sports bans. 36 of the current bills proposed are on the national level. And a lot of these focus on the idea of protecting women and children. It's kind of a false pretext. In reality, they are censoring trans identities in school, banning our healthcare, and barring trans people from public spaces and activities, attacking trans people and anyone who support us. So in Wisconsin, there have been 7 bills proposed, mostly on healthcare and sports. 4 of them failed, and 3 of them have currently passed assembly. A quick overview of these, 3 of them. No, one of them aims to ban gender affirming care for minors statewide. The other 2 are about sports, so they would force people to be addressed as their birth sex. An example of this would be man, male, boy, and ban trans people from sports. In Minnesota, there were 5 anti-trans bills related to sports and 1 to bathrooms. Luckily, all of those failed. And in Iowa, 22 anti-trans bills were proposed, but only 3 of them passed. 1 of them passed and banned gender affirming care for minors. 1 of them passed and prohibits instruction related to gender identity and sexual orientation in school districts, kindergarten to 6th grade. And the last one prohibits persons from entering single and multiple occupancy restrooms or changing areas in elementary and secondary schools that do not correspond with biological sex. So these bills are not in the interest of protecting minors. They are in the interest of harming trans kids and paving the way to create legislation against older and older trans people until it covers all of us eventually. These bills ignore our history. They are built on myths and stereotypes, misinformation. However, we have been lucky because some of the bills in our area have failed. Just let me see. Yes, most of the bills in our area have failed, and our very own Minnesota is actually a leader in protecting trans rights and is a sanctuary state. In our area, several bills have passed that do protect trans people. In Wisconsin, there is only 1 known law currently in effect that targets trans people, and that is the one that requires gender reassignment surgery on a birth certificate to change your sex. There are no protective laws, so the fact that we don't have bad laws is pretty good. Unfortunately, we don't have a lot of protective laws, so a lot of the laws in place are very up to individual interpretation and are also could be subjected to overturn or creating of negative laws. Minnesota has a laundry list of awesome laws. I'll try to go over these really fast. Protections for adoption, non-discrimination laws that include gender identity, not only sexual orientation, protecting LGBTQ students and people in healthcare. They also have shield laws protecting access to gender affirming care. State insurance is required to cover trans care, and they are actually banned from excluding gender affirming care on any kind of insurance. And there's also no restrictions for changing your name or gender legally. And Minnesota also has the option of the X marker that Will mentioned on driver's license. Iowa is an interesting state with very conflicting laws, I will say. They do have adoption protections, non-discrimination laws that include gender, and non-discrimination protections for LGBTQ students. They also have don't say gay bills and forced outing for students, sports and bathroom bans in school. Their state insurance does cover gender affirming care. However, gender affirming care is banned for youth. So not sure how they can cover something that's banned. And in Wisconsin, we do have our lovely Governor, Tony Evers, who has promised to veto any trans bills that pass the Senate. And there has been a lot of pushback on a lot of these bills. A lot of folks have stepped up and protested, have gone to their legislatures, have written their legislatures, and really said that we don't want these bills here. However, it is more important than ever to be educated on what is going on, because like I said earlier, a lot of people have no idea that this discrimination is happening, or at least don't know the full impact or the extent or how far it goes. They're like, I kind of know that trans people are being targeted, but I don't understand how incredibly undemocratic it can be at times. Trans legislatures are being illegally silenced and removed from the floor. Montana Representative Zoe Zephyr has been nearly single-handedly fighting for trans legislation all year in Montana and has been illegally ignored and silenced, meaning that her thousands of constituents are also being silenced. And this is it's kind of heavy, so I will leave you with one of the most inspiring quotes that I have found yet from Charlotte Clymer. They can try to ban us, they can try to get rid of our health care, they can try to deny us housing, credit, and public accommodations. They can try to shame us. They can try all they want to erase us, but at some point, they will realize the trans community is never going away.
Thank you, Adam. That last quote was very powerful. I will now introduce Dr. Erin Gutowski. Dr. Erin Gutowski is a pediatrician at the Gunderson Health System here in La Crosse. She is also the co-founder and medical lead of the Pediatric Gender Program. In her free time, she loves to spend time with family, including her fluffy and feathery babies, horseback ride, hike, and volunteer for local therapeutic animal organizations such as Horse Sense and Ambassadors of Love. Please give a round of applause for Erin.
All right, y'all. I don't know how I follow that. I'm going to do my best because that was crazy good. And yeah, I am so grateful to be here. Thank you so much for having us. I do have a presentation. I'm sorry, but I'm hopeful that we can kind of fly through it because Will did an awesome job of covering a lot of the introductory stuff. So, and I want to save time for questions for sure because I want you to all make sure you have time to ask your questions. Oh yeah,
It was working.
that's good because I love animations. So, obnoxious. Okay. Have y'all seen the gender unicorn before? Okay. This is like my best friend. So in gender clinic, I use this with families all the time because in general, right, like Will was saying, over 200 different identities that fall into the LGBTQ plus term. That's a lot of identities and a lot of people get them mixed up and that's totally normal, right? So when I use this with families, I think it's just a really nice grounding exercise to be able to talk through those individual steps. I think Will did a great job of already doing that for us. So thanks, Will. Made my job so much easier. One of the things that I did want to mention, so under sex assigned at birth, like Will had mentioned too, there is this little tiny bubble over here that's currently that purple bubble that says intersex. It's actually, the terminology has changed a little bit. We use differences in sexual development or DSD, and that's over 40 different medical diagnoses. There's a lot of different medical diagnoses that go into this term. And as Will had mentioned too, it can be body parts, it can be chromosomes, it can be differences in endocrine function that cause changes to a body's natural hormone production. So all of those things are really important to keep in mind. And most of our patients actually don't have these diagnoses because most of the patients who get diagnosed with differences in sexual development are not diagnosed until they're ready to have children. So for my patient population, it's awesome. I love kids. But because of that, I don't see a lot of these patients come forward. So it's much later that oftentimes happens. And I think it's just really important to recognize that we cannot tell just from looking at someone what their gender identity, what their sexual orientation is. It's just really important to ask and to have those conversations openly. I also do not recommend going as the gender unicorn for Halloween. Bad idea. Got my butt stuck in every doorway at Pete's clinic, and that mask is terrifying for children. So Diane Ehrensaft was, and she is, really the leading researcher in gender development in pediatric patients. She works at the University of California, San Francisco, and she has many awesome books. I highly recommend Gender Born, Gender Made if anyone ever wants a really great book read suggestion, or maybe the League of Women Voters wants to do like a book club. Yeah, I think we could do that. But what she really mentioned was that everyone's gender web is weaved uniquely based on their experiences, right? So nature, nurture, and culture all weave together throughout the life course. And what's really interesting is we have case studies in medicine of people coming out as early in 3 to 4 years of age. That's really not the norm, though. Most of my patients are coming out in middle school or high school when their body is changing and they're like, don't love this. This is not congruent with how I feel as a person. But we also have case studies of people coming out as old as in their 90s, right? So we know that this is something that continue to be explored throughout someone's life course. When I see patients in clinic as teens, a lot of times their parents come back to me later and say like, oh my goodness, I never really thought about my gender exploration. I never thought of it. And then I had a child who started to explore it, and then I started to explore it, and I realized I'm actually non-binary or trans or on the gender spectrum too. And I was like, it's so cool. It's so great that you have kids that really help open your eyes to that exploration, because otherwise many of us don't have that opportunity to explore. So Will already talked about the numbers. This is from the Williams Institute, and absolutely these numbers are definitely not, they're underrepresented for the population. So in June of 2022, 1.6 million people ages 13 plus identified as trans in the US. The percentage and number of adults who identified has stayed the same, but nearly 1 in 5 people who identify are ages 13 to 17 years of age. The survey results vary significantly depending on the state, which is probably not surprising to any of you, right? So you can see the variability of the numbers for gender expansive youth ranging from 0.2 to 8.6% of the population. That is based exactly on what Will said. How comfortable are these kids coming forward, especially if we have political or community ramifications to coming out or coming forward? And then how confidential are these survey results? So all of that affects children. 0.2% was closer to like the Mississippi, Arkansas, Alabama. 8.6% of the population was Minnesota, New York, California, Oregon. So it makes sense when you think about the political landscape. I'm going to share some statistics. These are sad. I'm going to quickly go through them. So some of these are from the Trevor Project, had a 2022 youth survey, and some of them are from the 2018 Human Rights Campaign. So 73% of LGBTQ youth reported they experienced discrimination based on their sexual orientation or gender identity at least once in their lifetime. This is also really important to note. So 51% of trans youth have never used restrooms or locker rooms that match their gender identity. You're probably asking yourself, Erin, why does that matter? Who cares? Well, I see so many of my gender patients that are coming in with recurrent urinary tract infections, constipation, bowel obstructions, chronic abdominal pain. Some of them don't use the bathroom at school and don't eat at school or drink at school, so they end up passing out at school. And syncopal episodes, right? So there are issues that just go far beyond the bathroom issue. I think when you actually meet these patients, you understand what their day looks like. Many of them are not using the bathroom all day. Many of them have underlying eating disorders because they don't feel comfortable eating, because they don't want to have to use the bathroom at school. That's not okay. And that's definitely affecting kids everywhere. 91% of transgender and non-binary youth said that they have worried about trans people being denied access to bathrooms. Trans youth are over 2 times more likely to be taunted or mocked by their family. And so what that really looks like is that most of my patients are not out to their parents. Many of them do not feel comfortable talking to their families about this because they've heard something negative being said in their household. And so a lot of the kids initially, on average, kids are thinking about this, talking about this with their friends for 2 years before they come out to family members, because they're just so worried and concerned about what others will think of them. And we see a huge housing crisis issue, right? So 1 in 5 trans people have experienced homelessness, and 1 in 8 have been evicted being transgender. Just being trans in America means that you can get evicted. I think this is really important. So this is information that came out in 2012. This was a research study done in Canada. It has been replicated several times since that time. And this is something that I use to show my parents when they come in how important it is to have one supportive parent. So all you need in your life as a trans youth is one supportive parent, and that has huge ramifications and implications as far as the positive health outcomes that are associated with that. So you can see in the blue, those are numbers of trans youth that have at least one supportive parent, and in the yellow, trans youth that have no supportive parents. So this study specifically looked at mental health outcomes, and you can see stark differences in the mental health outcomes. This is why we do gender clinic, right? It literally saves kids' lives, literally. We know this, right? We also know that if you're looking at toxic stress, just being bathed in anti-trans communities, not having that supportive community or supportive school, can affect how they can live their lives, right? And that absolutely has effect on term health outcomes related to autoimmune conditions, addiction, intimate partner violence, as well as heart disease and diabetes. Okay, so this model came out in 2003, y'all. I graduated high school in 2003, so it's an oldie but a goodie. And this really shows like death by 1,000 cuts, right? Like all the things that can happen that are really sad, right? Happen to trans people, and everyone's like, okay, but like, how is that helpful, or who cares, right? What we really know now, and this is the new model that really shows how this trickles down. And when we vote, all of those things are trickling down to our communities, not to the individual trans folks, but to all of our kids. All of our youth have to deal with those things. So this is from the National Institutes of Minority Health. And this is a really helpful research framework that I use in my practice currently. Because now Gunderson's to be doing some gender research, and we know how important that is to have the research to be able to move forward and say we're evidence-based practicing what we preach. But also to recognize that like these laws affect kids, they affect access, they affect care, they affect mental health rates, and we're seeing that currently. It's extremely, extremely devastating. So I just want to briefly touch on gender affirming care guidelines, and this is, again, I'm not doing this like just me out there, right? I've been here for 5 years, but all of these current guidelines are from the University of California, San Francisco, and every single medical organization, and every major medical organization in the country has gender affirming care guidelines. So you can look up the American Academy of Pediatrics. We all have them. The American Medical Association has them. So you can continue to look and research on those things to see what people are recommending and why. Gender variations are not disorders. There's no pathology there. We're not fixing a person, right? Gender expression is diverse and varied across cultures, requiring cultural sensitivity. Gender involves a weaving over time of biology, development, socialization, culture, and context. Gender may be fluid, but it's not always binary. Present mental health diagnoses are often secondary to the negative interpersonal and cultural reactions to a child, and gender pathology lies more in the culture than in the child. So I just want to briefly talk about our pediatric process, because there's a lot of misinformation about what gender affirming care is and what it's not. So for us in pediatrics, most of what we're doing, about 80% of my work is social, psychological support. So we are affirming gender by using people's names and pronouns, by teaching them how to safely wear clothing items that make their body feel comfortable and safe for them, for helping them get Children's Miracle Network grants. If anyone donates to Children's Miracle Network, like heck yeah. But they are amazing for our patients, and they help them find haircuts and clothing and different items that can just make them feel comfortable and safe in their body, which is what we want for all of our kids. So that's what we do. And that's really about 80% of my work. So I think a lot of people think like I'm dealing out hormones. That doesn't happen very often, right? Reversible therapies. So reversible therapies are things like hormone blockers. There are hormones that we can also prescribe as well. And I just want everyone to know, like, newsflash, we all have hormones in our body. They are all consistent of estrogen, progesterone, testosterone. We have all of them, right? So all of us having different levels of those hormones are what we're affecting when we're talking about these different hormone factors, right? So the fact that we're changing hormone levels for some of our patients, those have reversible factors and partially reversible factors. So those are things that we oftentimes talk about with our kids. There's partially reversible and reversible effects from hormones. Irreversible therapies do not happen in pediatrics, right? Like we do not do surgeries on pediatric patients. We just don't. I'm sorry, I don't know what to tell you. I think a lot of my kids wish that we could, but we don't. So those patients are waiting until the age of 18, and they are talking with their providers when they turn 18. And we they have to jump through so many hoops, right, to get surgeries. So I think people are thinking that this is happening and this is something that's happening very prominently all the time. It really is not. It never happens in my practice. I've never had a patient under the age of 18 have a surgery. Going to briefly talk through some of these things. We have a multidisciplinary team approach at Gunderson. And so it's not just me out there, it's myself and Dr. Alman Dixon, who's our integrated behavioral health specialist. She's a psychologist in our clinic, and we both see patients together to help affirm their gender, to pull parents alongside of them to help provide the family support that they need. And then we also have a pediatric endocrinologist who's available in case families have questions or if there are ongoing concerns. We have Dr. Sarah Long and Dr. JJ Tin, who are both psychologists who see our patients. And then when our kids get old, I don't see them anymore. So sad. They grow up, they turn 21 and they leave me. But Dr. Allred sees them in family medicine. And we also have a really amazing Planned Parenthood here in town that also has fantastic gender affirming care. All right, so these are the actual guidelines. If anyone's interested or wants to know more, the WPATH is the kind of the worldwide organization that has trans health standards of care. If you want to look up what the standards are currently, they are available on the web and anyone can look at them. So. I think at this point, I feel like it would probably be best to take questions. I want to give you guys some time, and I definitely have like way more slides, but I think I'd rather you have a chance to ask anything that comes up for you. Like, finish asking more questions.
Thank you very much. Thank you to all three of our presenters for some really interesting and informative presentations. We are a little late here, but we do have time for maybe one or two questions. We'll see. So are there any questions? Yes.
So what would you say is the youngest individual you had come with parents to talk about transgender?
So I have patients that are what we say is consistent, insistent, and persistent. If they are a 4 or a 5-year-old who are saying like, nope, I'm a boy, like that's pretty rare. I do have 1 or 2 patients that has been their experience. Most of my patients are in middle school and high school. So the average age of our first gender patient in our current population is 16.9 years of age. It's very rare to see them earlier than that, but they are in our clinic.
So how early would you start, say, hormone treatment or something like that?
That's a great question. Yeah. So hormones, we oftentimes talk about puberty blockers. So puberty blockers are a reversible, safe way to pause any sort of hormone from starting to develop a human body. So puberty blockers we can use in patients that have started puberty, but are in the early stages of it. And we actually have different staging to go off of. Those are actually prescribed by our pediatric endocrinologist, and that's going to happen when a patient has started the process. So usually, again, in middle school, they're going to be on a pause. And then most of our patients, if they're starting hormone replacement therapy, now, granted, you have to have both parents' consent to hormone replacement therapy. This is actually quite rare to do, right? So most of our patients are waiting until they're 18. I do have some families who are starting in the 14 to 16 year age range. So when other kids are developing in high school is when our patients may or may not go on to extra hormones to help with hormone replacement therapy. Yep.
Any other?
Thank you all. I have a question related to pronouns. I'm on social media a lot and I follow some LGBTQ plus people, and some people say that it's okay to go up to a person you don't know what their pronouns are and ask them, but I guess I want some input on like what
Yeah, I think definitely being respectful about it, because there are some folks who are like, well, are you a boy or a girl? And that's not quite the way to go about it. But there is also kind of misconceptions about that you could never ask anyone about their gender. It's kind of like the weight question. Never, no, that's not how it is. I think going up to someone, especially privately or respectfully, and just being like, hey, what pronouns would you like me to use? Or like, especially in journalism, how would you like me to refer to you in the paper or whatever media you're working with? Because a lot of people aren't out necessarily. So what they actually go by might also not be what they want in the paper. So if they come out to you and they're like, I use him, but at home that's not the case. Sometimes you can use they, them and slip it in there unnoticed, potentially, but that's definitely an individual case to case. But it is absolutely not bad to ask.
I think one of the best ways to do that is I introduce myself and I say, hi, I'm Will. I use he, him, and they, them pronouns. Then that gives Aaron the opportunity to repeat their pronouns back or to say, I don't understand why you said that. And then I can say, this is why. And, you know, would you be willing to share your pronouns with me? And then maybe they would.
I think the other important thing just to remember is that when someone does disclose their pronouns, like please use them and try. And like Will was saying, you do have to practice. It is something like I always tell my families too, like if you're gonna join the NBA, awesome. You're probably not gonna just start playing for the Bucks right away, right? You're not just gonna try out. You gotta actually practice. And so practicing and taking the time every single day. I ask my med students to do it. I ask our staff to do it. And I ask my parents to do it and to pick a time every single day that they really practice.
Help me with my ignorance here. It's a question about the La Crosse Public Schools. Have they taken any, do they have any policies governing the handle trans students?
Yeah, so the La Crosse Public School District does have a gender support plan. So when our patients are coming into clinic, they use something called the G-Safe Gender Support Plan. So we help our patients create that and advocate for that. They do have access to single-use bathrooms. The problem tends to be that those bathrooms are really far away from those patients' classes. And so making sure, I always make sure that my patients have notes to be able to access the bathroom when they need to, because not everyone is going to want to use the bathroom like when everyone else is using them. So it's a lot of those types of policies. We also have been working really hard in advocating for name changes in schools, as long, you know, and parents oftentimes do know about the process, but kids should be able to go by whatever name they're comfortable with in school. And so we've been working with La Crosse School District on that as well.
Yeah. Are there any questions in the chat box? No, okay. This may be the last question that we have time.
The Wisconsin Institute of Law and Liberty is currently suing the city of La Crosse over its conversion ban, and there was a meeting Monday night with the Wisconsin Institute of Law and Liberty in Onalaska. What would you ask of local organizations in order to support your community, and what can we do?
We were actually there for that, and the reason that happened, our very own senator in the Pride Center, what's Kate's last name? Anyway, Kate, set up a really cool thing. I don't know the process because I wasn't quite at the position I was yet, but she actually was a very, very big part of the reason why La Crosse banned conversion therapy. And we really pushed that and advocated for it, even with the threats, because it's incredibly anti-democratic to be like, don't pass this or we'll sue you. So we did it anyway. And I don't really think that there's a huge basis for them to go off of, because that's just how the government works. It's not like there was anything illegal. A lot of that is based on religious exemption laws, which get very, very hairy very quickly in what government and church both have power to do over one another or with each other. So that kind of thing comes about when people say, well, that infringes against my religion. And that's where it gets kind of icky. So I don't know how that's progressed or if they're gaining any foothold or anything, but that's kind of that story.
And conversion therapy is a type of therapy that generally uses inhumane practices to force somebody to not be LGBTQ, which that, I mean, that doesn't even happen. I mean, you can't force someone to be LGBTQ. That's either part of who you are or aren't. And in a lot of cases, most of our medical and psychological places in La Crosse would not be doing that anyhow, because the medical association and the psychological association all said all of that is not good. It's not positive. It shouldn't be used. I think the city kind of backed up a little bit and basically said it would only be for medical and psychological facilities, when I think some people were hoping that maybe some of it would also be related to church, but of course that's not going to happen. So
Yeah, every major medical organization and the American Psychological Association and all of the governing bodies in major medicine and psychology have essentially spoken out against conversion therapy as being non-evidence-based and being dangerous and detrimental to someone's health.
Well, thank you very much once again to all three of us. I'm sure there are probably some questions, so you may want to ask them afterwards. But I just wanted to extend a couple of thanks here. One expression of thanks is to the other members of the program committee who helped put together this program. Those include Deb Luchin, Leslie Wegener, Barbara Soderin, Karen Kroll, and Sophia Root. We want to thank our tech for today, which is Patty and Barbara Soderin, who did such a wonderful job with making this a hybrid meeting. And finally, thanks to the waterfront for offering such a lovely space and meal for us. And we hope to see you again next month, December 13th, Wednesday at 11:30 right here for our next Lunch and Learn. And the topic at that time will be the final 5 and ranked choice voting. Registration and more information can be found on our website. It's LWVLacrosse.org. Thank you so much for coming and have a wonderful afternoon. And one of them are. Yeah.